The very first thing that the pattern says for each block is spray your fabric with starch and press well. There are a few reasons to spray your fabric. If you pre-washed, and I would not recommend it on this because you're getting small pieces, but if you had pre-washed, it puts some body back into the quilt and makes it easier to handle. Even if you haven't pre-washed, it makes the fabric a little bit stiffer and keeps you a little more accurate when you're cutting and makes it easier to handle the fabric. It also, when you have cut on the bias, will help stabilize that bias while you're sewing it to help avoid stretching it out of place. And the other thing we found that it did last year is if your fabric is going to shrink, it will most likely shrink when you have sprayed it with your starch or sizing and then pressed it. So you can use spray starch. You can also use magic sizing, which is available in the grocery store in the laundry section, or you can use Best Press, which is a spray starch alternative. It comes in several different scents and several different sizes as well. This one that I'm showing you is scent free. You can get refills in the gallon size and refill these spray bottles, which is a little more economical. Whichever you're using, you're going to lay your fabric out on your pressing surface and spray lightly. You don't need to have it sopping wet. And then we are going to press. Pressing is not the same thing as ironing. Ironing is moving the iron back and forth. Pressing is an up and down motion, and that's what we're going to use in quilting. Because if you iron when you're quilting, you can stretch your fabric out of square. And especially when you're piecing blocks, you can get them wonky just with your pressing. So it's an up and down motion. And you're just going to press these pieces until they're dry after you have starched them or used your sizing or Best Press on them. So I am not going to talk about that every month. This is going to be your one demo. I'm going to spray it, press it dry. For this quilt, an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance is going to be pretty important. Most sewing machines have the option of getting a 1/4 inch presser foot, and these presser feet are from 3 different brands of machines. These two will go to the same machine, but there is a difference. One's metal, one's clear plastic, and this one actually has a blade that you run the fabric up against. Just because you have a 1/4 inch presser foot does not necessarily mean you are going to get an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And I'll get to how to test for that. The other thing I wanted to point out, some machines also have guides that you can screw into the bed of the machine and run your fabric up against that. So some important things for getting accuracy in your quilt. I like to use a 50 weight thread. I happen to buy mine on cones because I go through so much of it between quilting and piecing. We have several different brands of 50 weight thread in the store. Metler, there's Presentia, there's Aurifil. Even a 50 weight thread can vary because there are different numbers of fibers wrapped together. There's a 2-ply, there's a 3-ply. Color can vary, and not that you're going to see it here, but sometimes a darker color is going to be a heavier thread. Some other tools might help keep your 1/4 inch seam allowance accurate is a straight stitch plate. I wanted to show you the difference. These both go to the same machine. This is a straight stitch plate. There's just that little hole for the needle to go up and down. Your machine probably came with a zigzag plate similar to this so that the needle can go into different positions. Also, needles can make a difference. I buy mine in bulk because I use so many of them, but a Microtex needle is a good option in a size 70 or 80. A Microtex has a sharp point, so it stitches a straight seam. A universal needle is a cross between a ballpoint and a sharp needle. So it has some of the tendencies of a ballpoint needle where it is kind of sliding over your fibers and your fabric to find an opening to go into. So you may not get quite as straight as seams with a universal needle as you do with a Microtex. If you are a pinner, and I admit I do not pin a lot, I avoid it whenever I possibly can, but there are times that you're going to need a pen. You do not want one of these that are labeled as quilting pens. They are big and fat, so when you pin, it distorts the fabric. This one's pretty good, it's thinner. This is a flower head pen, and this one is a really fine pen. So when you're pinning pieces together, you don't want to take as big a bite as possible. You just want to go in and take a nice small bite. As small as you can will distort the fabric less. There are also pens like these that are the fork pens. So if you're matching up an intersection, and in that case I don't have one handy right here, but I usually put the pen straight through the intersection. And then you can come back with the fork pen and pin on both sides of that so that you're keeping your seam allowance where it's supposed to be, then pull out that pin. So pins are important. Every little bit plays into how accurate your seam allowances are. To test my seam allowance, I have cut 3 1.5 inch wide strips of fabric, and I'm going to stitch them together with the long sides matching on what I think is 1/4 inch on my sewing machine. I did want to point out that most, if not all, the Vikings that we sell in the store right now do have the option to set your machine up for 1/4 inch with your standard A foot. To do that on the Sapphire, I'm going to go and pick my B menu, or not my second menu, not B, and use the arrow keys to do that, and say OK, and it has automatically jumped to the menu 2 with stitch number 10, which is a 1/4 inch stitch. So what that does is move the needle to the right so that it's going along the A foot. So you can do that if you want, rather than buying a 1/4 inch foot. As you can see, I have a piece of fabric that I already have the needle stitched into. That is a good idea to have at the beginning and the end of your piecing. If you're chain piecing, it wouldn't be till the very last piece when you're going to cut it off. What that does is it keeps the thread from bunching at the beginning, so you won't get little knots at the beginning. It also means that you probably won't be as likely to swerve when you get to the beginning or the end. So I have my machine set for what I think is going to be 1/4 inch. I'm running my piece through, and I can have a second piece here if I want, because I would usually just be swapping that little starter end or out back and forth between the beginning and the end, but I didn't have my scissors sitting here when I started sewing. I'm going to take this, open it up, and put my other strip along the piece that I want in the middle, and then sew that seam. I like to sew with my needle down. That way if I pause, it doesn't swerve out of place. Okay, once I have it stitched, I can tell almost for sure by looking at this that it's going to be too wide. What I'm going to do is open up the piece that I just stitched, and you can just start by finger pressing. And then I want to measure that center piece, and if my 1/4 inch seam is exactly right, then my center piece is going to measure 1 inch, since I cut it 1.5, and I'm taking off 1/4 inch on each side of that. And mine's not quite 1 inch, it's a little bit small, which means that I need to make my seam allowance narrower. So if you have a machine where you can move your needle position, then I want to move it probably just 1 notch to the right. So to do that, I just come over here on the machine, and I'm going to move it right here. So my needle went over just 1 notch to the right. So now that I have moved my needle position, I need to stitch test this again. So you can either cut new 1.5 inch strips, or you can tear the seams out of your one you just sewed. I'm going to sew it together again, and I will test it again, and I will keep doing that until that center piece measures 1 inch. The reason I talked about thread making a difference is how thick your thread is going to take up some space when that seam allowance is turned. I'm going to finger press to start. And I'm going to check it, and it looks like I still need to move my needle position at least one more time. So you will just keep moving it until you get that accurate 1 inch in the middle. I'm not going to keep doing it for the camera. So what if your sewing machine, you can't move the needle position, or you move it as many times as you possibly can and you still can't get exactly that 1/4 inch, or you just want something because you are a new sewer and you want something to help keep everything straight, or you're having a little bit harder time seeing, you might want to try this sewing edge. They are vinyl strips that you can put on the bed of your machine, and they are repositionable and reusable to a certain extent. So let me show you how those work. This is a little guide that we sell in the store. There are others as well. And what it has is several different little holes in it for different width seam allowances. I have sunk my needle into the 1/4 inch one, and I'm going to put that down. Or another option is, if you bought the sewing edge, then inside in the directions it has lines for lining up your scant 1/4. So they have you trim off this edge, and then you would line up this line under your needle, and you would actually want to put your tip of your needle down on this line. Right now I'm going to use this because it's easier to see. And then I'm going to take a strip of my sewing edge, and I don't want it to cover the feed dogs. I want it to be in front of the feed dogs. So this machine is a top loading bobbin, so I need to be able to get in and out of my bobbin case. So I would position this right along the guide and press it down, and I would trim it off here as well. Then I want to bring my needle up and take the guide out of here. And I'm not trimming this off because it's just for the camera today. And then I'm ready to sew again. Now, if you have moved your needle around, you're going to have to remember what your needle position was when you set this up. And some reasons you might want to move your needle, even if it's not absolutely necessary, is sewing machines tend to pull one direction if you don't have the fabric on the feed dogs on both sides. So as you can possibly see, this edge is sitting in the middle of the feed dog. So I could move it so that the whole piece of fabric was on that feed dog. The nice thing about this sewing edge is it gives a little bit of a raised edge. So there's something there for the fabric to roll along, to run along. You really don't need your guide behind your presser foot because you've already sewn by the time the fabric gets there. And you should just let the fabric the sewing machine feed the fabric through. You don't want to be pulling on it. Okay, let's check that one. So this is my strip that I fussed with. And when I measure it, and I like to measure not on the actual inch lines on my ruler because they're usually thicker. I'll pick a 1/2 or a 1/4. When I measure between those two, that looks pretty close to 1 inch to me. So all I've done so far is finger press it. I want to go ahead and press it with an iron to be doubly sure. So this is a good opportunity for me to talk about pressing seam allowances. The first thing I do when I'm pressing is I press the seams the way they were sewn to set the seams. That helps the thread to interlock in there with the fabric, and it also flattens it out. So I'm going to do that to all the seams. And again, we're pressing, not ironing, so it's an up and down motion. And now, depending If I want to press toward this outside strip, I put it on top and flip the fabric up this way. And I may slide the tip of my iron lightly down there, but I'm not running it back and forth. So I'm going to hold the iron down to press it. So there's one side. Then I'm going to flip it around and do it again. If I was pressing toward the red would have been on the top. So press it the way it was stitched. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to use the edge of the tip just to push it into place lightly, and then it's just an up and down motion if I'm moving down the length. Press it. I don't want to stretch it out of shape. It's especially true if you have any bias edges. So now I'm going to measure again, and that looks pretty good. It's an inch. So that's what you're going to do to get your accurate 1/4 of an inch. Some people say they do it every time they sit down to sew because you may be positioned in front of the sewing machine differently. Something may have changed. When you find your accurate 1/4 inch, though, I would make a note of it. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not so disciplined that I do it every time I sit down to sew. It's up to you. If you're not getting accurate results, though, you may want to go back and check your 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Your kit this month has 5 pieces of fabric in it. Yours have stickers to tell you which blocks they go to, but these 2 pieces go to the block C, which is the Chimneys and Cornerstones, and these 3 pieces are going to be used for the Evening Star, the E block. I have already sprayed my fabric with sizing best press starch, whatever you choose to use, and pressed it dry. So I'm ready to get going on my blocks. I'm going to start with block C. The first thing we're going to do is cut down our blue strip. On all the pieces, when I first start, I'm going to give myself a clean cut edge. Now you don't have a lot extra on these, you do have a little bit, but I'm going to line my ruler up and just take a sliver off at least the first 2 edges here. So that gives me a clean edge to measure from and cut from. Now we are going to subcut these pieces into 2 3/4 by 1 1/4. However, there is 1 2-inch square. So 1 1/4 is times 2 is 2 1/2. So I'm going to line my 2 1/2 mark up on that edge that I cut, and I did cut off a short edge as well. So I'm going to line up a line on my ruler with that. Make sure that's what it is and cut it off. I'm not going to worry about clean cutting that edge off first. Now I would recommend that you go ahead and cut off a 2-inch square first, because I'm likely to just slice the whole thing in half and not have 2 inches left anymore. So I'm lining up my 2-inch mark with the short edge that is clean cut, and any line here or 2 lines with my long edge. When you've got it, I'm going to cut it off, and I'm just going to move my ruler back to the 2-inch mark. I have my 2-inch mark lined up here and here. And cut. Now I can take the rest of the blue strip and just divide it into 2 1 1/4 inch strips. So I'm going to line my 1 1/4 inch strip up with the long cut edge and cut. Throughout the year, you're going to see me cutting my smaller pieces by backing my ruler off. So if math is not your thing to do in your head, then get out a calculator and calculate how many your different measurements. So what I'm going to do, I have written it down this time, I don't know. I'm going to cut my strip down first to 8 1/4 inches. Then I'm going to back my ruler up to 5.5 inches, and then I'm going to back it up to 2 3/4. So I'm going to line up 2 lines with the long edges. I'm going to line up my 8 1/4 mark on my ruler on my short end that I have clean cut. So here's my 8 1/4. I have 2 lines lined up here. And I'm going to cut off the end. Then I'm just going to back the ruler up to 5.5. Again, I'm keeping 2 lines lined up here. And when my 5.5 inch mark is on the short end, cut, and then I move it back to 2 3/4. Again, to keep it straight, we're lining up 2 lines with the long edge as well. And cut. So now, out of that strip, I have 3 1 1/4 by 2 3/4 inch pieces. There are a couple reasons for cutting this way. First off, if you have ever taken a strip and just kept cutting pieces from this end, you have to stop and move them out of your way, so it's a little bit faster. The other reason is, again, if you have cut like this, then eventually your angle starts getting off. If you cut it this way, you're always cutting from the same point and you're keeping your pieces straight. You're not cutting and then measuring from the new cut edge. You don't have to do it this way, but give it a try. It is faster once you have the numbers down. So we're going again, just to show you again. I am lining up my short edge with the 8 1/4 mark. I'm lining up my long edges with 2 lines on the ruler. Cut, then 5.5. And cut, and 2 3/4. Cut. So out of the blue, we have ended up with 6 rectangles and 1 square that we're going to use. Next, we're going to cut down our tan rectangle, and it's going to be cut into 9 different pieces. If I add them all up, it comes out, my big rectangle needs to be 10.5 by 5 1/4. So as always, I'm going to clean cut 2 edges to start. And then you can either have it on a mat that's small enough that you can pick the mat up and rotate it, or you can rotate the piece of fabric. Then I'm going to cut it. I'm lining up my 5 1/4 mark on the long edge, and on the short edge I'm lining up my 10.5 mark. So when you're sure you have it, then go ahead and cut. Time to change the blade. So now we have a rectangle that should be clean cut on all 4 sides. We're going to cut that down. I'm going to leave the long strips, so I'm going to be cutting it down this way. So first I go 5 1/4 is how wide it is. I'm going to put my ruler back to 2.5 inches. So I'm lining up my 2.5 inch mark with the long edge. I do line up a line with both ends here to keep everything straight. So double check 2.5, and then I want to move the ruler back to 1 1/4. Again, I'm lining up a line with the short edges, both short edges as well. So when I'm sure I have the 1 1/4, then go ahead and cut it off. Now if you don't move these, you can keep cutting. If you're worried about it, cut them 1 strip at a time. So I have a 10.5 inch piece going this way. I want to put my ruler down at 8.5 on the short edge. And again, I am keeping my lines lined up right here. So it's 8.5. When you're sure you've got it, then go ahead and cut. And then I'm going to move my ruler back to 5 inches. And again, I have lines lined up on both long edges and cut. So now I have 9 pieces cut and ready to go. And I'm ready to start sewing. Set aside the tan strips that are 1 1/4 inches wide and the 2-inch blue square. You're going to take all of the tan pieces that are 2 3/4 inches wide, and we're going to add the 2 3/4 by 1 1/2 inch strips to the ends of all those pieces. So just take them to the sewing machine and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. I have stitched my blue pieces to my tan pieces, and I just wanted to point out that I do chain piece. That just means I put one piece in right after another, so you can see that they're all attached to a chain. When I'm ready to start putting the other end on, then I just clip one off from the chain and move it to the front until they're all stitched together. The pattern does give you pressing instructions for these, and remember, pressing is an up and down motion, not an ironing motion. So the the shortest one is going to be pressed toward the 2 blue strips, and the other 2 pieces are both going to be pressed in toward the tan strips. So that is going to make a difference in how they nest later on. My pieces have been pressed just like I told you, so that one is out towards the blue, in towards the tan, and in towards the tan. We're going to cut each of these down into 1 1/4 inch strips. So again, it's a little bit wider so we can clean cut again. When I'm cutting a piece strip, I like to line up a line on the ruler with the seam if I possibly can. So it wouldn't hurt to line up a line with the outside edge either. So I have it lined up with my seam, I have it lined up with my outside edge, and I'm going to trim off a narrow strip. Now I just need to cut 2 1 1/4 inch pieces from this. So 1 1/4 times 2 is 2 1/2. So I'm just going to line up my 2 1/2 inch mark. And everything should line up now since I lined up the last time, but on the seam and on the cut edge. So 2 1/2. And then I'm going to move back to my 1 1/4. And I do keep lining up whenever I can with my seams and my outside edges. So I get 2 pieces like this. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing to the other 2 strips. There are my 1 1/4 inch wide strips with the cornerstones on the ends. And now I'm ready to start putting the block together. We're going to start with our 2-inch square and then our 2-inch long 1 1/4 tan pieces. So they're going to be sewn to both sides of that blue square. On this piece, our seams are pressed toward the blue square in the center. And now we're going to add our shortest cornerstone 1 1/4 inch strip. And the seams are pressed in opposite directions. It's pressed toward the blue and toward the blue here. So when we put them together, those seams are going to just nest right together. They're going to butt together. And that will help keep them all aligned while you're stitching. If you want to, you can use pins. Usually when I'm stitching straight seams like this and the seams are all nesting the way they should, I don't bother with pins, but that's completely up to you. I know there are people out there that are big time pinners and then people that aren't. The seams after the cornerstone pieces are sewn on are pressed away from the center, and then we just add our next 1 1/4 inch strip to the sides of that. Once those pieces are sewn to the edge, we're going to press away from the center, and then we're ready to add the next cornerstone strips to the top and the bottom, so the medium-sized ones. Once again, the seams have been pressed away from the center, and we're going to add our last unpieced strips to both sides of our square. Once again, the seams are pressed toward the outside, and our very last step is to put on our last 2 cornerstone pieces. So there's the finished Chimneys and Cornerstones blocks. Our last seam was again pressed toward the outside. This block at this point should measure 6 1/2 inches. My 3 pieces for the evening star have all been sprayed with whatever you're using to stiffen it and pressed dry. Our first step is to take our blue-gray square and cut it down to 3.5 inches. So I'm just going to clean cut 2 edges. Rotate it and then line my 3.5 inch mark up both here and here. And cut. This is the Lazy Girl Flying Geese by 4 no math ruler, and if you choose to use it, then we are going to use measurement D. Otherwise, you will use the measurements that are given in the pattern. If you're just doing this one block, then there's probably no point buying this ruler. But if you're going to make lots of different sized flying geese and don't want to have to calculate your different measurements, then this is a nice ruler to have. So I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to first clean cut 2 edges of my red square, my red rectangle. And then, if you're using the flying geese ruler, the color that is going to be the points on the geese are going to be cut on the broken lines. So here we'll be using the D mark. So to get that, we're going to line D up, so it's right there on the cut edge of our red square that we've clean cut, and then you can just butt another ruler right up next to it. So make sure D is there. I'm putting this ruler next to it, slide the flying geese ruler out and cut. And then I just line the D mark up and cut. Cut. We need 4 squares, and just point out on the ruler. Right here it tells you that you need the solid line, so you're using the D measurement in both. You need 1 square of the solid line, and then you need 4 squares from the broken line, which is what we just cut. And if we slide down to D, it says that our finished size is going to be 1.5 by 3 inches. On my background fabric for this block, again, I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And if you're using the No Math Flying Geese ruler, then we would come in and line the D mark up. Again, with this line and this line, we're using the solid line this time because it is for our background fabric. Cut, cut, and I do want to be careful that I don't cut into this other big piece if I'm using it. So that's going to be the background for our flying geese. From what's left on our background fabric, we want to cut 4 2x2 squares. So I'm just going to line up my 4-inch mark here and here and cut a big 4-inch square. Then back my ruler off to the 2-inch mark, and I'm lining up my lines with this end and these 2 sides to keep it all straight. And then if I don't move it, I can come up and again line up my 2-inch mark and cut, and that gives me my 4 2-inch squares. The pattern gives us two different methods to mark the back side of our red squares. The first method is just to take a regular ruler and line it up point to point. If you want to keep it really straight, then take your 45-degree line and line it up along one edge. So we're going point to point and just draw a line. If you're using this method, then you're going to take your big square and we're going to put two of these guys going corner to corner, right sides together on top of our large square, and then sew 1/4 of an inch away from that line on both sides of the line. The second option in the pattern for marking the back of your red squares is to use the magic wand. The magic wand has a line through the middle of it, so you would line that line up with the 2 points on the square and then mark a line on both sides of the magic wand. So in that case, you would be sewing on the lines rather than beside the line. No matter which method you use to mark this, you're going to end up with 2 parallel lines of stitching. Once you have stitched it, we are going to cut it apart between those 2 lines. You can use scissors if you want, or a rotary cutter. Then you will take it to your pressing surface and press toward the red. Once you have pressed the red triangles, or pressed toward the red triangles, then on each of these 2 units, we're going to line up one of our squares, right sides together, and if you use the single line, the line is going to go straight up. This is the double line, but I actually have it marked on both sides of the center because I was marking on the same piece of fabric. Either way, it goes corner here and then the corner up through here, so your straight edges on the square are going to line up with the background piece, and you will again either sew on both sides of the line, or if you use the magic wand, you'll sew on the lines. As always, I chained pieced my units, and now we just need to cut them apart between the 2 stitched lines. I'm using a rotary cutter, but again, you could use scissors. I do need to clip these threads too. And then we're going to once again press toward the red, and we end up with 4 flying geese units. So 2 by 3.5, and we're just going to clip off the dog ears to make it easier to deal with. And you're going to want to do that on all 4 units. Now we're ready to put our star together, and we're going to put it together in rows. So look like this. Now, when I'm sewing on something where there's a point and a side that isn't, I like to sew with the piece that has the point on top so that I can make sure when I'm stitching that my needle hits right there in the point. So that's how I'm going to do it. So we'll put it together into rows first. My rows are sewn together, and the top and the bottom strips I pressed toward the outside squares, so it looks like that. And on the middle piece, I pressed toward the big square in the middle. Our last step is to sew the rows together, and because our seam allowances are going opposite directions, they will nest together when we're sewing. And again, I'm going to put this piece on top when I'm stitching so that I can hit right there with my needle and keep my point. There's the finished evening star. The last 2 seams were pressed in toward the middle. The block should measure 6.5 inches at this point.